On the last Friday of July, after 38 years of teaching, Margaret Ellis stood alone in classroom 4 and wondered how on earth a life could fit into 6 cardboard boxes. The children had gone home 2 hours earlier. The corridors were quiet now, stripped of the noise that had filled them all day. No chairs scraping, no doors banging, no one shouting, "Miss, he took my ruler," from the other side of the room. Just the soft hum of the old fluorescent lights and the occasional cry of gulls beyond the playground. Margaret looked around. The walls were almost bare. The colorful displays had been taken down. The photographs had gone. The multiplication posters, the weather chart, the faded map of Europe that had been hanging beside the window for longer than anyone could remember. Even the little wooden sign above her desk had been removed. Mrs. Ellis, Year 6. She had wrapped it in newspaper and placed it carefully in the second box. She wasn't sure why. She certainly wasn't planning to hang it anywhere at home. Perhaps some things were simply too difficult to throw away. Margaret lowered herself into her chair and rubbed her knees. 38 years, she said aloud. The empty classroom did not seem impressed. She smiled. When she had begun teaching, she had been 23 years old and terrified. She had worn long skirts, sensible shoes, and glasses she didn't really need, because she thought they made her look older. Her first class had contained 34 children. On her first morning, one of them had put a drawing pin on her chair. Another had released a grasshopper into the reading corner. And before lunchtime, a boy called Stephen Marsh had been sick into the classroom sink. Margaret had gone home that evening, sat on the edge of her bed, and cried. The next morning, she had gone back. She had been going back ever since. There had been thousands of children. Margaret could no longer remember all their names. That bothered her sometimes. Faces remained when names disappeared. A girl with enormous glasses who loved astronomy. A boy who drew horses on every scrap of paper he could find. Twins who swapped jumpers during registration because they thought Margaret wouldn't notice. She had noticed. She usually noticed more than the children realized. There had been difficult years, too. Children who came to school hungry. Children who fell asleep at their desks. Children who flinched when adults raised their voices. Children who carried far more than children should ever have to carry. Margaret had learned early that teaching had very little to do with spelling tests. She stood again and opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Mostly rubbish. Old staples. 3 dried-up board pens. A packet of mints that had probably expired during the previous government. Then, right at the back, beneath a pile of yellowing worksheets, she found a small blue notebook. Margaret frowned. She pulled it out. The cover was battered and soft around the edges. On the front, in her own handwriting, were the words, "Class Notes, 1998 to 1999. Oh, goodness. She sat down again. Teachers were told not to keep unnecessary records now. Back then, things had been rather different. Margaret had kept little notes about children she was concerned about. Nothing official. Just reminders to herself. Ask Sarah about Mum. Check whether Lewis has brought lunch. Speak to Mr. Patel about reading. Sometimes she wrote things down because there were simply too many children and too many things she was frightened she might forget. She opened the notebook. The first few pages brought back almost nothing. names she vaguely recognized, incidents she did not remember. Then she turned another page and stopped. Halfway down was a name she hadn't heard in nearly 30 years. Daniel Mercer. Margaret stared at it. For a moment there was nothing. Then, as if someone had opened a door inside her memory, she saw him. Thin boy. Dark hair that was always slightly too long. Uniform rarely quite clean. Sleeves pulled over his hands. He sat at the back whenever he could. Daniel Mercer. Margaret turned the page. There were several entries. Daniel refused to read aloud again. Very capable when he thinks nobody is watching. Asked why he never hands homework in. Said, "What's the point?" Margaret's smile disappeared. She remembered now. Not everything, but enough. Daniel had been 11. Quiet one day, furious the next. He could turn a simple question into an argument in seconds. If Margaret praised him, he assumed she was mocking him. If she corrected him, he would stare at the desk and refuse to speak for the rest of the lesson. He was bright, very bright. But he seemed almost determined that nobody should discover it. Margaret continued reading, spoke to Daniel after school. He says he's stupid. Then underneath, he isn't. Margaret swallowed. She remembered that afternoon. Daniel had thrown his exercise book across the classroom. Not at anyone, just across the room. It had hit the wall and fallen behind the bookcase. "Pick it up, please," Margaret had said. "No." "Daniel, doesn't matter." "What doesn't?" "Any of it." The other children had been watching. Margaret had sent them out for assembly and asked Daniel to stay behind. He had stood beside his desk with his arms folded, angry, defiant, and frightened. Margaret had retrieved the exercise book. His story was inside. 3 pages about a boy escaping a burning city. It was one of the best pieces of writing anyone in the class had produced. At the bottom, Margaret had written, "Excellent work. You have a real talent for this." Daniel had crossed it out so hard the paper had nearly torn. Margaret remembered holding the book up. "Why did you do this?" Daniel shrugged. "Because it's rubbish." "No, it isn't." "It is. I'm the teacher. I think I'm reasonably qualified to judge." "You have to say that?" "No, I absolutely do not." For half a second, she had seen the tiniest trace of a smile. Then it vanished. "You think everyone's good?" "No, I don't." That had surprised him. Margaret had pulled out the chair beside his desk and sat down. "Some people are good at maths, some at football. Some can sing, some can draw. Some people have to work much harder than others, and some people haven't found their thing yet." Daniel stared at the floor. "And some people are useless." Margaret had been quiet for a moment. "Who told you that?" He didn't answer. She hadn't pushed. There were times when teachers knew not to. Instead, she had tapped the exercise book. "You wrote this." "So?" "So a useless person didn't write this." He shook his head. "You don't get it." "Then explain it to me." He looked at her then, not angry, just tired. "I'm never going to be anything." The memory landed in Margaret with surprising force. She looked back down at the old notebook. There was another entry, one sentence underlined twice. Daniel. Told him not to let other people decide what he is capable of. Margaret read it again, then again. Something shifted in her chest. She could almost hear herself saying it. Not exactly, but something like it. Perhaps he had told her someone at home said he would never amount to anything. Perhaps another child had laughed at him. Perhaps Daniel himself had said it. The details were gone. All Margaret remembered was sitting beside that unhappy boy and trying desperately to make him see what she could see. Potential, not certainty, not greatness, just possibility. She turned the page. There were more notes. Daniel stayed behind to finish story. Put hand up in English today. Read 2 paragraphs aloud. Very quietly, but he did it. Then, end-of-year report. Encourage secondary school to keep an eye on him. Needs someone to believe in him until he can do it himself. Margaret closed the notebook. For several minutes, she sat completely still. She wondered what had happened to Daniel Mercer. She had wondered about former pupils before, of course. Teachers did. Occasionally, one appeared in the supermarket. Sometimes a grown man would approach her and say, "Mrs. Ellis?" And Margaret would panic internally while trying to reconstruct an 11-year-old face beneath a beard. Some had become nurses, builders, accountants, parents. One had become a police officer. Another ran a bakery. Once, a woman in her 30s had hugged Margaret in the frozen food aisle and thanked her for teaching her long division. Margaret had found that one particularly baffling. But Daniel had never come back. At least, not that she remembered. She glanced at the clock. Nearly 5. She should finish packing. Instead, she reached for her phone. It took less than a minute to discover that there were a great many Daniel Mercers in Britain. A solicitor in Manchester, a football coach in Kent, a plumber in Bristol, a photographer, an estate agent. None seemed right. Margaret laughed at herself. "What are you doing?" She put the phone down. 30 years had passed. Daniel would be 40 or thereabouts. He could be anywhere. He might have changed his name, moved abroad. Perhaps he wouldn't even remember her. Margaret placed the notebook in the box beside the wooden classroom sign. Then she finished packing. But Daniel Mercer came home with her. Not literally, of course. The notebook did. And the question, what happened to him? Over the next week, Margaret tried to ignore it. Retirement was surprisingly busy. There were flowers to arrange in vases, cards to read. A pension meeting she'd already forgotten most of. Her daughter took her for lunch. Her neighbor gave her a bottle of wine. Margaret cleaned the kitchen cupboards because apparently this was what retired people did when they suddenly discovered Monday mornings existed. But every so often, she thought of that thin boy at the back of the classroom. I'm never going to be anything. Eventually, she opened the notebook again. This time, she searched more carefully. She knew Daniel's approximate age. She knew the secondary school most of her pupils had attended. She even remembered that he had once mentioned an older sister called Joanne. The internet was not Margaret's natural territory. She could send emails. She could order groceries. She could operate the school's online attendance system provided nobody changed the password. But after 2 evenings of searching, she found something. A school website. Mr. Daniel Mercer, head of English. Margaret stared at the photograph. The man was smiling. He was perhaps 40. Dark hair, now streaked faintly with gray. He wore a jacket over an open-collared shirt. There was something familiar around the eyes. Margaret leaned closer to the screen. No? She clicked. A short biography appeared. Mr. Mercer has taught English for 17 years and joined St. Anne's Academy in 2018. He is passionate about supporting pupils who lack confidence in their own abilities and believes that the right teacher can change the direction of a young person's life. Margaret stopped breathing for a moment. She read the sentence again. Then she sat back. "Well," she whispered. She felt suddenly ridiculous. Tears had filled her eyes. She wiped them away. It might not be him. There could be another Daniel Mercer of exactly the right age who had grown up in exactly the right area and become an English teacher. But Margaret knew. She simply knew. For 20 minutes, she composed an email, then deleted it. She tried again. Deleted that too. Everything sounded absurd. "Hello, Daniel. You probably don't remember me. Too apologetic. I believe I may have taught you in 1998. Too much like a tax investigation." Finally, she wrote only, "Dear Mr. Mercer, my name is Margaret Ellis. I taught Year 6 at Brookfield Primary School for many years, and I believe you may have been in my class in 1998 to 99. I recently retired, and while clearing out my classroom, I found an old notebook containing your name. I hope you won't mind me contacting you. I simply found myself wondering how life had treated you. Warm wishes, Mrs. Ellis." She nearly changed the final line to Margaret, but somehow she couldn't. To Daniel, if this really was Daniel, she had always been Mrs. Ellis. She pressed send and immediately regretted it. 3 days passed. Nothing. Margaret told herself she didn't mind. He was busy. It might be the wrong person. The email might have gone into some administrative black hole. Then, on Thursday morning, she opened her laptop. There was a reply. The subject line contained only 2 words. "Mrs. Ellis?" Margaret clicked. "Dear Mrs. Ellis, I have rewritten this email about 6 times because I genuinely don't know where to start. Yes. It's me." Margaret covered her mouth. She continued reading. "I remember your classroom. I remember sitting at the back. I remember the stories you made us write every Friday afternoon. And I remember you. More than you probably realize." Margaret's eyes blurred. She blinked and carried on. "I wasn't an easy child. I know that now. At the time, I thought everybody hated me, so I made sure I hated them first. Home wasn't particularly good. I won't bore you with the details, but by the time I got to your class, I had already decided what sort of person I was going to be. Nothing." Margaret stopped. The words sat there on the screen. Nothing. She remembered the crossed-out praise in his exercise book. "You told me something once after I threw my book across the classroom." Margaret laughed through her tears. So he remembered that too. "You said, 'Never let somebody else decide what you are capable of. They don't get to write the ending before you've even started the story.'" Margaret froze. She had no memory of those exact words. None whatsoever. But Daniel did. "I don't know whether you remember saying it. I doubt you do. But I do. I thought about it for years. Secondary school wasn't magically easy. I still got into trouble. I left at 16 and worked in a warehouse. But I kept reading, and I kept writing. When I was 21, I went to evening classes and retook some exams. Eventually, I went to university. English." Margaret smiled. "Of course. I became a teacher because somewhere along the way, I realized that the moments I remembered most clearly from school weren't lessons. They were the moments when somebody noticed." "You noticed me." Margaret stopped reading. She stood from the table and walked to the window. Outside, her neighbor was pegging washing onto the line. A delivery van passed. Somewhere, a dog barked. The world looked completely ordinary. And yet Margaret felt as though something enormous had happened. 30 years ago, she had sat beside a boy for perhaps 10 minutes. She had gone home that evening and probably made dinner, marked books, watched television, gone to bed. She had forgotten the conversation. Daniel had carried it with him for the rest of his life. Margaret returned to the laptop. There was one final paragraph. I tell my pupils something similar now, especially the difficult ones, especially the ones who have already decided their failures. So I suppose, in a way, you are still teaching? You just didn't know it. Margaret cried then, properly. Not the polite tears she'd shed at her retirement assembly when the children sang a song and the head teacher gave a speech. These were different. She cried for Daniel, for the boy he had been, for all the children she had taught whose endings she would never know, and perhaps a little for herself, because retirement had frightened her more than she had admitted. For 38 years, she had been Mrs. Ellis, teacher. Someone needed her every day. Then suddenly, there had been cardboard boxes and an empty classroom and a wooden sign wrapped in newspaper. She had wondered, quietly, whether any of it had mattered. Now she had her answer. A week later, Margaret drove 60 miles to St. Anne's Academy. Daniel was waiting outside reception. She recognized him immediately. He recognized her too. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. Then Daniel laughed. You look exactly the same. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That is an appalling lie. I thought teachers didn't age? Oh, we age, usually during parents' evening. He laughed again. And suddenly Margaret could see the 11-year-old boy inside the man. Not unhappy now, not hiding, just there. Daniel showed her around the school. His classroom was untidy. Margaret approved. Books were piled everywhere. Quotes from novels covered the walls. On one display were stories written by pupils. Daniel stopped beside one. This lad wrote that. Margaret read the first paragraph. It was good, very good. He knows that, does he? Daniel smiled. Not yet. Margaret looked at him. Daniel shrugged. Give me time. They had tea in the staff room. He told her about his wife, his 2 daughters, his career. Margaret told him about retirement and admitted she had already reorganized the kitchen cupboards twice. Eventually, she took the blue notebook from her bag. Daniel stared at it. You kept that? Apparently. She opened it to his page. Daniel read the entries silently. When he reached the final one, he stopped. Needs someone to believe in him until he can do it himself. He touched the words with one finger. I didn't know you thought that. I did. He looked at her. I was horrible. You were 11? I was still horrible. Yes, occasionally. Daniel smiled. Then his expression changed. Mrs. Ellis? Yes. Did you really not remember saying it? Margaret shook her head. Not those exact words. Daniel seemed amazed by that. Margaret closed the notebook. That's the frightening thing about teaching, Daniel. Half the time you don't know which bits they're going to remember. He nodded slowly, then smiled. I think that's the wonderful thing too. When Margaret left the school that afternoon, Daniel walked with her to the car. Before she opened the door, he said, There's something you should know. Margaret turned. Every September, when I get a new class, I choose one child. One? One who reminds me a little bit of me. Margaret listened. Not necessarily the worst behaved, usually the one who's already decided they can't do anything. What do you do? Nothing dramatic. He shrugged. I keep an eye on them. Margaret smiled. I tell them when they've done something well. I make them try things they're frightened of. I annoy them relentlessly. Excellent teaching technique. I learned from the best. Margaret rolled her eyes. Daniel continued. And sometimes, when one of them says they're useless, I tell them nobody else gets to decide what they're capable of. Margaret looked away for a moment. Across the playground, a group of teenagers were leaving school, laughing, shouting, pushing one another. Ordinary children on an ordinary afternoon. Somewhere among them, perhaps, was another Daniel. A child who had already decided how his story ended. And somewhere there was a teacher who might change it without ever knowing. Margaret hugged Daniel goodbye. Then she drove home. That evening she opened the final cardboard box from her classroom. Inside was the wooden sign. Mrs. Ellis, Year 6. Margaret ran her thumb across the lettering. She had planned to put it in the attic. Instead, she carried it upstairs to the little spare room where she kept her books. She placed it on the shelf above the desk. Beside it, she put the blue notebook. Margaret stood back and looked at them both. 38 years. Thousands of lessons. Thousands of children. Most of their stories would remain unfinished to her, and perhaps that was all right. Because somewhere, in another classroom, Daniel Mercer was standing in front of a child who believed he was nothing, and words Margaret had spoken nearly 30 years earlier were still traveling. From teacher to pupil, from pupil to teacher, from one frightened child to another. Margaret switched off the light. For the first time since retiring, she did not feel that something had ended, only that it had gone somewhere she could no longer see.